Retro-style indie games are an interesting beast. The developers try to mimic older games of varying success. Whether they use pixel art or modern graphics to portray a game that imitates 8 or 16-bit classics, most are really good but are lacking something. Freedom Planet is one of those games that nails the 16-bit era, in this specific case the Sega Genesis, perfectly. In Freedom Planet, you play as one of 3 anthropomorphic creatures: Lilac, Carol, or Milla. For this playthrough and review, I went through the game as Lilac, but I don't think there's any differences in the stages that you play, but instead the mannerisms of each character, such as their attacks, platforming techniques, and the obvious visual variety. Freedom Planet's gameplay is normally compared to Sonic the Hedgehog, and this is accurate, but also not. The part that's accurate is the speed. It's not quite blast processing, but it's fairly obvious to see why it was often compared to the blue one. Occasional loop-de-loops, springs, monitors that give different elemental shields, monsters that are primarily robotic in nature. It feels like it belongs right in the Sonic universe. But there are some major differences. For one, as you're traveling the stages, you'll notice that the combat is much different, with characters gaining strikes instead of just bouncing off of heads or a homing attack. Lilac, for example, has a tail swipe, a whirling tornado jumping attack done by double jumping, and a downward kick. Many enemies take more than one strike to defeat, so fighting enemies does tend to slow the game down, but only slightly. It doesn't fully break the momentum of the game, as although enemies take more attacks to take down, it still happens quickly. Another major change is how your life works. You'll see many blue gems floating around, and they are also dropped by enemies. You might assume they function as rings, but they don't. Lilac won't drop them when getting attacked by the enemies. Instead, she has a standard life meter, in the form of those leaves under the stamina bar. In order to replenish this, you just need to find more orange leaves floating around the stage. You need 2 leaves in order to replace 1 health point. You also need to keep in mind that some enemies will do more than 1 point of damage, and some bosses can whittle down that life very quickly with repeated strikes. Back to those blue gems though. There's a counter at the top of the screen, starting from 200. I thought at first that I needed to collect 200 of them before finishing the stage, but I found quickly that this isn't the case. Instead, it's just a simple collect 200 gems, gain an extra life. Oh. Once you reach 0, you gain that life, and it swings back up to 200. Gems are plentiful, so lives will be gained somewhat quickly. By the time I reached the final stage, I want to say that I had a little over 20 lives. Sure, I died a few times, but it wasn't uncommon for me to replace that lost life a few minutes later. However, the final stages start getting slightly challenging, especially the final level. There's about 10 total worlds, with each containing about 3 or 4 levels. There's usually at least 1 mini-boss per level, and the bosses can be hard until you figure out their patterns. But the final stage is unforgiving in throwing a ton of the alien soldiers at you, along with environmental hazards, and the final boss, Brevin, completely obliterating you in seconds if you don't know what you're doing. The only other thing to really mention are the bonus games you can run into, enabled by collecting a yin-yang and finishing the stage. You're brought to a lone room with a floating die, and Lilac gets to strike the die to roll it. Whatever it rolls, you gain, whether it be shields or lives. I only found the yin-yang maybe 3 times, but it's still a pleasant surprise and beneficial whenever I ran into it. So the gameplay to the game is very simple to pick up and learn, so what's left to talk about? How about the scenes in between stages? Freedom Planet is extremely story heavy, much more so than Sonic. Some people maybe think that the story is bland, but I enjoyed it. It's not overly complicated, so it's easy for my little brain to comprehend and follow. There's also plenty of humor thrown in here and there, such as Carol's sarcastic comments, Milla's innocent remarks, and even one of the mayors of the city's odd RPG-like remarks. The only complaint I have is that some of the scenes between the stages seem to last as long as the stages themselves. If they were cut down to maybe 2 minutes or something, I think it would have been a little bit better, but even as I say this, the current length isn't really detrimental. It's just an opinion. The graphics of the game are simply fantastic. They promote the 16-bit era, although with a little bit more effects and stuff like that. Kind of how Sonic Mania has that same feel but more, if that makes sense. Most stages are extremely colorful, and a respectable amount of detail is applied to the characters. Many bosses are large in size and make the field of fights themselves feel grand. There really wasn't many times where I was playing the game and thought, this section looks boring. The soundtrack is equally as good. Granted, I wouldn't say it's quite as good as the blue ones, but it's still pleasant enough. There is a sound test that can be unlocked by finding the 100 cards floating around in the world. but you'll enjoy the tracks as you're playing. The sound effects also mimic the bassy feel of the Genesis, especially in regards to the explosions. So is Freedom Planet a worthy game to check out? Absolutely it is. If you're looking for a straight Sonic clone, you may need to look elsewhere, as the game takes the speed but has unique gameplay to differentiate itself from its competitors. It has a decent story, but the humor is fantastic, the graphics are beautiful, and the soundtrack is pleasing. It's also somewhat short, with about 10 stages, so you could theoretically finish it in one sitting, although multiple characters and difficulties will give you a bit of replay value. And if you viewed the story and aren't entirely enthralled by it, there is a classic mode that skips the scenes and goes straight to the levels. I may have to look into getting a physical copy, as Freedom Planet is a great game that you should really check out. Final score? 6 out of 7. This is Reaper. Happy fragging.